EGROW. It's a think tank which we established in 2018. Our aim and objective, and this is along with Dr. Arvind Virmani, who was our chairman till he joined NITI as a member. Along with Dr. Arvind Virmani, we both were of the view initially, and then we have a team which shared that view that we would like a research-based think tank in Delhi. A think tank which will provide policy advice on a solid research base. And so it's a research-based policy in NCR, and our aim is to provide to the government and to other stakeholders who ask us the research-based policy advice. The think tank has been blessed. As we started, within 2 years, COVID was setting in, and we realized that research work is going to get impeded because of COVID. So with the blessings of the board and our advisory, Dr. Surjit Bhalla is a member of our advisory board, we decided to move on to webinar-based discussions where we would bring the best people from across the world on Indian and international issues, discuss them, and try to bring a blend of Indian speakers and foreign speakers. And I must share this with you. On a happy note, we have had 3 Nobel laureates come and speak. We have had an excellent blend of academicians and policymakers from IMF, World Bank, from London School, from Harvard, Columbia, Yale, Princeton. And we have had discussions on topics which have been basically socioeconomics, monetary, and fiscal policy. We were fortunate under the G20 when India was the president. We did a 11-session series on new international economic order. We attempted one on climate. We could only do 6. We could not do more because we were so overbooked. We also attempted on women empowerment. We did again 6, but we could not complete the 10 series that we had initially envisaged because of overbooking. Even now, we are booked till end of September. The think tank takes pride in discussing contemporary issues and bringing the best minds from across the world to bring in their viewpoint. We have just last Tuesday done a webinar on employment situation in the country, and in the next 2 weeks, we are going to come out with another webinar on employment issues in our country. This is an illustration. One of the issues that has been very, very important in our country are issues like the relationship between fiscal policy and inflation, the interest rate story that we have, and also never dying issue of foreign exchange reserves and capital controls. We were fortunate to have time from Dr. Subbarao, who had just published this book, and these issues were covered in this book quite extensively in various chapters. Though those chapters are not titled as an economist, but the moment you scratch in that chapter and you realize, oh, it's an economic history that is being narrated here. So we realized that this book is very relevant for us. So I invited him, and despite his busy schedule, we were able to get time from him. And today is the day when he is discussing those issues with us in the book. To discuss this book, while we had the governor, former governor himself, looking at the structure of the book, there was something about his civil servant days. So we requested, and we were lucky that Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, himself foreign finance secretary, former finance secretary, agreed. And the deputy governor from the RBI, Madam Shyamala, who should chair the session. That was a very important thing. So Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who has been into policy making for many years, he was part of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, where former governor had worked. He was also part of the International Monetary Authority, the executive director there, and he had the global perspective. So we requested him, and we are fortunate he also agreed to come and chair the session. On the subject and why we chose this and the team, let me now introduce each of the speakers. So first I'll start with Dr. Bhalla, who's chairing this session. As I've already mentioned that he has been on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has been also at the IMF in the capacity of Executive Director. He has worked earlier in the World Bank. He's been a member of the Secondary Markets Advisory Committee of SEBI and also the National Statistical Commission of India. We all know Dr. Bhalla writes extensively on economic issues and is not shy of taking the bull by the horn. Our main speaker for the day, of course, is former Governor RBI. His book his book completely narrates the story of his career, how he started as a civil servant, how he wanted to do his PhD, but the PhD and him were never coming together. And every time he would attempt to do one, something or the other would happen. So he had an academic bearing, an academic orientation. Finally, he did it. Then he was the finance secretary of our country. He was in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and he was important member there as member secretary. He has worked with Dr. C. Rangarajan, who I think is an economic don as far as we Indians are concerned. And in his book, as he mentions, that a professor tells a student that, you can say, if you do not know the answer, I like that paragraph, sir, where it is advised, you can say that as per Dr. Rangarajan, because he has written so extensively and worked in so many committees. So, and then he becomes the governor, and he does not give up his academic career just after he quits his job or after his tenure is over. He continues at Yale teaching students, and the years that he writes about Yale are also very interesting in the book. Of course, I'm sure he's going to speak all that at length. We have the first discussant, I would say, is again a member of the Indian Civil Service, Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg, who himself was administration and public policy. I have known him from his days when he was the finance secretary in Rajasthan. I used to be the GM in the Reserve Bank doing ways and means advances, and he would be, and we would interact. I always held him in high regard, and we thought it would be good if he joins us and gives us his perspective. As you know, he also is an author and has published a number of books on India, fiscal policy, and various issues. But the most important one, which I would say, is his commentary on the budget, which he wrote. The last speaker for the day is our revered Madam Shyamala Gopinath. She was the deputy governor at the RBI. She has been there for a very long time, nearly 4 decades, and we have all worked with her, and she really commands the respect of each one of the persons in the Reserve Bank because her diligence, her expertise, her in-depth knowledge has been intense. She has worked in various capacities, and of course she was there when former governor was there, but I know her that she has worked in important departments of the bank like capital account management, foreign exchange reserve management, payment and settlement system, financial sector regulation and supervision. She's been all over the financial sector very, very extensively. With this, and of course, she also had a stint at the International Monetary Fund. With this brief introduction of the subject of EGROW and the speakers, I hand over the session to the chairman, Dr. Bhalla, to take the proceedings further. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think I jumped the gun a little bit. So let's look forward to Dr. Subbarao's presentation. On to you,
thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Bhalla. Thank you, Charan. First of all, my thanks to the EGROW Foundation for offering me this platform to talk about my book, Just a Mercenary. Over the last few months, I've spoken at several book events, but I still struggle to tell a comprehensive, structured story. So let me tell some stories. Let me start with my first story, which is that I became governor of the Reserve Bank of India on the 5th of September 2008. 5th of September 2008 is a very significant date in the history of world finance. Not because I became governor, but because of the dramatic events that took place in the weeks after I took over. 5th of September 2008, I take over as governor. 7th of September, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were taken over by the government. 9th of September, countrywide, a large commercial bank went down. 10th of September, AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, came to the brink of a meltdown. 12th of September, the crisis spread to retail banks. Washington Mutual blew up. 13th of September, Merrill Lynch, a leading investment bank, collapsed. On 15th of September 2008, the Big Bang, Lehman Brothers collapsed. So the fall of storied institutions in US finance, culminating in the fall of Lehman Brothers, plunged the world into a devastating financial crisis. The world, which is global economy, which is basking in the glory of what came to be called the Great Moderation, was shocked into a downturn, probably the biggest downturn since the Great Depression. Global finance was plunged into a near-death experience. Governments, central banks, regulators, policymakers all around were concerned, bewildered, anxious. Markets were seized with fear and panic. And ordinary people, public everywhere, were scared and worried about their money, their savings. That crisis, which started in the subprime sector of the US, ricocheted around the world and affected virtually every country. India was affected too. Our growth slumped, rupee nosedived, banks panicked, all our financial markets went into a tizzy. But in India, there was dismay, disbelief, denial about why the crisis should hit us. The story was that it is understandable that banks in the US, banks in Europe got affected. They got into a crisis because those banks had indulged in excesses. They had indulged in subprime lending. They had indulged in toxic assets. Their regulators were sleeping at the wheel. But here in India, our banks were responsible. They were well behaved. Our regulators were vigilant. Why should we be affected by the crisis? So the story that came around out of all this churning was that this new governor came and brought the crisis with us. We should not have been affected by the crisis at all, but this new governor came and brought the crisis. There was no way I could defend myself against it, so I took that in my stride and went along. But wherever I went, wherever I traveled, people would ask me, "Sir, when will the crisis end?" As if I knew. So I would play along and say that the crisis, as you people say that I brought on the crisis would end when my term is over. And for good measure, I would tell them when my term would be over. But here's the thing. The week after I left the Reserve Bank of India, the crisis ended. For 5 years, there was one crisis after another. There was the GFC, there was the inflation crisis, there was the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, there was the GFC, there was the rupee tantrums. But the week after I left the Reserve Bank, everything was hunky-dory. The economy got onto a stable track. Growth started going up, inflation started coming down, rupee remained stable. So if there's one prophecy on which I wish I was wrong, it was that, but that was not to be my fate. So there were many people who helped me through managing the crisis, navigating the crisis. One of them is here on the panel today, Deputy Governor Shyamala Gopinath. They all were part of that great institution, the Reserve Bank of India, and helped me navigate the crisis, what was in effect a baptism by fire for me. But why am I telling that story? I'm telling that story because it illustrates an important transition in our country, a transition of our economy from a closed economy to an open economy. The reason we were affected by what is happening in the US and Europe was because we were integrated into the world. We were integrated into global trade and global finance. The essence of the 1991 reforms was actually to integrate the economy into the system, into the global system. If you throw your mind back to that period, the Asian crisis of 97, 98 and the global financial crisis of 2007, just 10 years apart. We were only marginally affected by the Asian financial crisis. We were significantly affected by the global financial crisis because in that 10-year period, we were integrated into the world. So that was an important transition. But the question is, what's the transition got to do with my book? Let me explain. I approached writing this book just, I had no structure, no theme. I just started writing notes to myself. And then it eventually turned into a book. But when it all got together, I saw it as a finished product. I realized that I could tell my story through several overarching themes. In fact, reverse engineer a theme. One of the themes I could reverse engineer for my book is actually to tell my story through the several transitions I saw in my life and in my career. And one of the big transitions is this one, the transition of Indian economy from a closed system to an open system. Let me talk about another important transition I saw. Transition from gender disparity to gender parity. Over the last 50 years, we saw this around the world. We've seen this in India, a transition, a shift from gender disparity to gender parity. About 15 years ago, I was on an airplane and there was a pre-board announcement when we were all seated by the captain. And the person sitting next to me, I didn't know him, he was a stranger. He said, if I had a chance, I'll get off the plane now. I said, why? He said, the pilot is a woman. So last week, I was on a flight and the pilot was a woman. She made the announcement. We were completely nonchalant. So that's how our sensibilities and sensitivities to gender have changed. Aspirations of girls across the country have gone up. Last month I was at a function, a 15-year-old girl, I think she's high school. She came to me and said, sir, can I take a selfie? I said, okay, take a selfie. And after that, I asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up and you finish your studies? I thought she would say, I want to be an IAS officer like you. I'd be a governor like you. What she said was, I want to be an astronaut like Sunita Williams. So aspirations of girls have moved up, partly because of smart professionals, inspirational professionals like Shyamala, Gopinath, and Risha Thora to work with me. Girls today in the country, they want to be IAS and IPS officers. They want to be finance sector professionals. They want to be corporate executives. They want to be engineers, doctors, journalists, professors, entrepreneurs. They want to be Kalpana Chawlas. They want to be Geeta Gopinaths. They want to be Indira Nuis. But, I want to talk about this transition from gender disparity to gender parity first in the narrow corridor, narrow sense of the civil services, which is part of my book. Take the IAS, for example, we can look at the transition from gender disparity to gender parity in the civil services from two angles. One is at the time of recruitment, other is career management. If you look at recruitment, from about 1950s until the early 70s, women in the civil services, particularly in the IAS, were just a trickle. At the end of the 1960s, women constituted just about 9% of the total IAS. When I joined the civil service in 1970, just about 15% of my batchmates were women. Today, I believe about 30% of IAS recruits are women. And across the country, about 20% of IAS officers, serving IAS officers today are women. So we have come a long way, but we are far from declaring victory. That's about recruitment. Let's talk about career management. In the early years, there was discrimination against women IAS officers. In fact, there were certain posts reserved for men, like commerce, finance, industry. These are all male bastions. Women used to be posted to welfare departments or at best to regulatory departments. In fact, up until the mid-1970s, women were not even being posted as collectors. being a collector of a district is the defining job of an IAS career. Women were denied that opportunity. But as I read in my book, in 2022, of the 14 districts in Kerala, 10 had women as collectors. So that's a significant change. But we still have to go far away because we still have to get a women cabinet secretary. But we moved quite far along from gender disparity to gender parity. But if we open up and look at this transition in the larger world, there has been significant progress too. 30 years ago, there used to be this famous quote by a famous economist which is, if poverty has a gender, it is female, and if poverty has a face, it is that of the girl child. And we all remember, the advertisements on Doordarshan. There would be a household, a low-income household in a village. The woman would be feeding her husband and the son, while the daughter is doing household chores a little distance away. But that advertisement, that commercial no longer appears, which is illustrative of the change that's happened. I myself remember 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when I used to visit villages, my recall is of skimpily clad girls, ashen faces, shallow cheeks, vacant eyes, anemic looks, scruffy hair. But today, if you go into the hinterland of the country, what you see is healthy girls wearing a uniform, going on a cycle to school. That's a significant change. A remarkable transition in our primary education. In fact, experts say that we must evaluate our success in primary education through 3 parameters: enrollment, retention, and achievement. Enrollment, first, enrollment of boys has been 100%. Even for girls today, it's nearly 100%. That's for many reasons, most importantly because of the mammoth midday meal program that India runs. There are many things that I'm proud about in India. One of the things that I'm proud about is this midday meal program that we run. Serving a hot midday meal to hundreds of millions of children every workday is a phenomenal achievement in development experience. And that has been responsible for getting recruitment up to near 100%. Retention too. Girls used to drop out, but retention of girls has improved because of the effort over the last 20 years to build toilets for girls. Achievement levels are still poor. Poor for boys, poorer for girls. We've got to go a long way. But the point I want to make is that we moved a long way from gender disparity to gender parity. That's part of my book too. In fact, I write in the book about how I got sensitized to gender neutrality the hard way. I have no time to tell that story, but I want to say that one of the lessons of my life and career is the transition from gender disparity to gender parity. I want to talk about another transition that I've seen in my life and career, particularly in my career, the transition of federalism from a docile federalism to a cooperative federalism to a contentious or confrontational federalism. If you take the last 75 years since independence, 3 phases: docile federalism, cooperative federalism, and contentious federalism. Let's look at these 3 phases from 2 dimensions: a political dimension and an economic dimension. The first phase of docile federalism, running from roughly independence up until the mid-1970s. In the political space, there was a single party, the Congress party, which ruled both at the center and in the states. And Pandit Nehru, who was the prime minister, was seen more as a national figure than as a party figure. In the economic dimension, the center had complete dominance. The center decided how much states would get, what they would spend it on, how they would spend it on. Center decided where public investment would take place. The center decided where private investment would take place through licensing and controls. So the central government had complete hegemony both on the political and economic dimensions of the country, and we sort of acquiesced in that. The second phase of a federalism, which would run roughly from the mid-1970s until the mid-1990s, when reforms had taken root. In the political dimension, we saw regional parties coming up, regional aspirations rising. In the economic dimension, though, even as the political dimension got contentious, the economic dimension remained largely cooperative. It is defined by that belief in the socialist philosophy, part of which was that the state must intervene to help backward states. So if the central government gave more to backward states, or if there was some cross-subsidization, we all accepted it or acquiesced in it. The third phase, which runs from around the mid-1990s up till now, is what I call the phase of contentious federalism. In the political dimension, several regional parties had come up. They had come into office in several states. They have started having influence on the central government. We saw that the United Front government of Devagowda and Gujarat was actually supported by regional parties. And the UPA for 10 years and the NDA for the last 10 years had regional parties as the coalition partners. And we know that the present NDA government depends on the support of two large regional parties for its survival. So in the political dimension, regional parties have come in in a big way, having large influence. That political cloud has also transcended into the economic space. The ability of the center to dispense patronage has diminished or actually disappeared. Public sector investment is no longer there. Private investment is delicensed. Planning commission is abolished. Private players decide where they're going to invest. Finance commission transfers are the main basis for transfer from center to states, and they are formula driven. So in the third phase, running from around the mid-70s, from the mid-90s until current time, both the political and the economic space got more contentious. And this we are seeing in our ability as a country to implement reforms. If you take the first generation reforms, the Blitzkrieg reforms from 1991, followed by reforms in other product markets, liberalization, deregulation of trade, investment, external sector, financial sector, they were all in the central domain. The central government could push those reforms without consulting the states. In fact, the story around that time used to be that the reforms were being driven not by the central government in its entirety, but just by the North Bloc and the Joke Power. These second generation reforms that we have to implement today cannot be implemented without the cooperation, indeed the consent of the states. And we saw this play out several times over the last 20 years, the dramatic way in which states stopped the FDI in single brand retail, how GST implementation became hostage to states' grievances or representations for over 15 years, how land, labor, and investment reforms today are hostage to politics. So what I see is that in the past, center-state differences could be resolved harmoniously even across political parties. But now there is sharp polarization along political lines, which manifests, among other things, in opposition to reforms. We saw this in the latest budget when the finance minister announced special dispensation to coalition partners, the Telugu Desam Party and the JDU in Bihar. And the opposition had criticized that as a political bias. It's another question how much substance there is in that patronage to those two states. But the very fact that the finance minister mentioned those two states in the budget speech had been criticized by the opposition, which is illustrative of how difficult it is for the central government today to show bias towards one state or another. I want to say that center-state relations are complex in every country. They have been problematic in rich countries like the US, Canada, and Australia. They've been problematic in emerging countries like South Africa, Indonesia, and India. They've been problematic in poor countries like Ethiopia, Ghana. In fact, in Europe, we've seen this resentment of North European countries to subsidize South European countries. And they say that one of the reasons for Brexit is actually resentment in the UK over subsidizing South European countries. We saw East Timor separate from Indonesia because of issues of sharing of returns from resources. The civil war in Ethiopia or in Sudan are at their heart problems arising out of contentious federalism. And China, we know, has problems of eastern states militating against the raw deal being met out to them. So we've moved from docile to cooperative to contentious federalism, and that's been part of my career, and I write about that in my book. I had the privilege or the opportunity to serve under state governments led by regional parties. I had the privilege or opportunity to serve in the central government led by large coalitions. And NTR, who was chief minister of our state in Andhra Pradesh, had actually come to office. His political platform was based on a strident anti-center stance. So center-state contentious federalism is very much part of my book. I write about that. So I talked about three transitions. In fact, there are several transitions I saw. Transition from closed to open economy, transition from gender disparity to gender parity, transition of a federalism from docile to cooperative to contentious, transition of a predominantly agricultural economy to becoming a global byword for a digitally driven service economy, transition of a poor country, once synonymous with mass deprivation, becoming a low middle income country which has all but extinguished extreme poverty, and most dramatically, transition of a country that believed that it is condemned to Hindu rate of growth, becoming the fastest growing large economy in the world today, warts and all, for whatever it's worth. So those transitions are all part of the story I tell in the book. Finally, I want to make a comment about why I wrote the book. As I said, I did not write the book to tell a story through transitions. The transitions is an afterthought. But why did I write the book? I wrote my first book, Who Moved My Interest Rate, narrating my experiences as the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, 2008 to 13. That book came out in 2016, just about a couple of years after I stepped down. Governors before me had written their books, but mine was the first full-length account by a governor of an entire tenure. That book was motivated by two reasons. First was that the 5 years I spent at the Reserve Bank, 2008 to 13, marked an unusually turbulent period for the world and indeed for India. I believe that the dilemmas and challenges that I confronted, my successes and setbacks that I talk about in the book, will have some policy lessons for future policymakers. The second reason I wrote that book is because I had a strong urge to demystify the Reserve Bank and to explain to the larger public how what the Reserve Bank does affects their everyday lives. To my pleasant surprise, that book found an audience in fact much larger than I expected. Many people who read that book, particularly youngsters, said, "Sir, why did you write a book about your entire career, 35 years in the IAS?" I pushed back against the suggestion for several reasons. For the first reason is that civil service memoirs are a crowded genre. In terms of quality, they span the entire spectrum. They're high quality memoirs, medium quality, low quality. Among high quality memoirs, I must mention this book, We Also Make Policy, by our panelist today, Subhash Garg, a distinguished IAS officer. So among those high quality books. But the high quality civil service memoirs have been high quality because the authors have been able to integrate the story into the contemporary social and economic context. I was not confident that my story or my book would pass muster by those exacting benchmarks. The second reason I pushed back against the suggestion of writing a book on my IAS career is because I joined the IAS in 1972, more than 50 years ago. It is a different context, different milieu, different time frame. I was not sure that the stories I would tell would resonate with the larger reading public today. Some of the stories I might say would be interesting because they're quaint, like a struggle with a landline phone. But whether much of my story would resonate with the larger public, I was not sure. I was concerned that it might just be an egoistic enterprise. The third reason I pushed back against the suggestion is that I had kept no notes or a diary. I had to fall back on my memory. And jogging through 50 years of memory proved to be a daunting experience. I was concerned that selective memory would embellish accomplishments and minimize failures. So for all those reasons, I pushed back on the suggestion, but those calculations changed somewhat during the COVID lull. I started writing roughly as notes for myself, for my children. My wife, Urmila, who read some other stories, encouraged me to bite the bullet and expand that into a full book. So what we have today, the final product, is the result of that labored endeavor. I hope you enjoy reading that book. So one question I want to answer, which Chairman Bhalla asked, what's the rationale for this title, Just a Mercenary? I considered a few other alternatives, but ultimately decided on this for the following reason, which is that, we're all prone to complaining about our country, how this country or the society is unjust, unequal, unfair. But when I look back on my life and my career, I find that this country has given me quite a lot. I went to a Sainik school with a government scholarship. I got an IIT education with a scholarship. I got into the IAS and had an opportunity to serve the country. I finished my career as the governor of the Reserve Bank. So it's given me enormous opportunity. A mercenary, as I see, is one who does whatever he does just for the money. Someone who fights a battle depends on who pays for him. If you take the Russia-Ukraine war, people are fighting for Ukraine because they've been paid. If Russia pays them more, they'll defect to the other side and fight for Russia. So they do their best, but do their best for money. They're not driven by a larger or bigger cause. So the thought that runs in my mind, has run in my mind over the last 50 years, runs in my mind even today, is whether I have given back to society for all that I have received. So that's a question mark. No answer. I leave it to the readers to decide. Chairman Bhalla asked one more substantive question, but I will defer answering that until the panelists have spoken. In fact, I'll defer to Shyamala to answer the question first. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah. Shyamala?
Yes, Surjit.
You are?
Oh, I need to speak now? Oh, I thought we'll hear from...
Yeah.
Garg, Subhash. Okay. So thank you, Charan. And of course, it's great to have Surjit as chairing the session. And definitely when Charan mentioned that the discussions on Dr. Subbarao's book, I was, there's no way I would have missed this seminar. And of course, I know Subhash for quite some time and enjoyed working with him. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll enjoy the discussion. And Dr. Subbarao's comments itself was such a treat to all of us. As I would say, I mean, as all of you who have read the book would agree that this is a masterpiece and a must read for all civil servants and all policymakers. And even the earlier book, Interest Rates, is really a book that everyone should read. And it is really, it's written in such a, a manner which even a layman could read and understand. About the book, I will not say, I think it's just what's mentioned in the flap of the book, that it's warm, engaging, and earnest account of an extraordinary career that is bound to inform and inspire young professionals. And I was reading one of the reviews where the writer describes Subba very characteristically, that he tells his story as if he was a bystander, allowing the reader to make their own inferences. I really like that. Actually, Subba was very clear from the time he joined the RBI that there is need to demystify, which he also mentioned in his remarks. And RBI took a number of steps towards this end, and he involved the top management to we drew up a program to participate in outreach events across the country. He left a great legacy on this demystification, and we can now see the extent to which this has happened. It has really accelerated. I will just pick up some of the events and issues from the book. Of course, many are well known because of the earlier book too. But I think it's always good to go over it. And hopefully all this will interest those who have not read the book to read the book. I first met Dr. Subbarao when he was finance secretary. And he's written in the book as, and of course he also was a board member. And one of the tasks which he was entrusted with by the finance minister then was to resolve a serious difference of view between the RBI and the government. And this relates to, lending foreign currency reserves to Indian Infrastructure Company Limited for, use in infrastructure projects in India. Naturally, RBI, when we had received such requests from various others, from exporters, oil, sometimes even for, like setting up a sovereign wealth fund so that we could use it for acquiring assets overseas. So this was not the first of its kind, but there was a lot of, like he mentions, the finance minister was really, was very enthusiastic about this proposal, which was recommended by the Deepak committee and also supported by Dr. Ahluwalia. So the RBI was not, didn't want to, like Dr. Subbarao mentions in the book, that this is a thin end of the wedge. And definitely this would lead to several requests for dipping into the reserves. We felt it was not legally feasible to rent to IFCL India too. But the government decided that IFCL would set up a subsidiary in UK and RBI could lend to that company. And also, instead of a loan, if it can't be in the form of loans, RBI can invest in the foreign currency bonds that would be issued by IFC UK. In fact, what I really like about it is the way Subbarao handled this. He was asked to speak to the non-executive directors to inform them about the government interest in seeing this through. And he also told the governor that he has done that he has spoken to the non-executive directors. But one statement which also Subbarao mentions in the book, which he explained to the FM, was that while it was $5 billion, while that would not really make a huge dent in the reserves, but it also not make any dent in the huge needs of the infrastructure, which required far larger amounts. He canvassed the government's position in the board meeting, And the board members, and of course, he spoke to the board members individually on the phone as instructed. The board approved the proposal to invest up to $5 billion in the bonds issued by IFC UK. But I think one good thing about some distinguished directors on the board was that he suggested two caveats. One, that the proceeds should be used only for capital expenditure outside India for the infrastructure projects in India. Otherwise, if it was lent in India, it's nothing but, or even if it is lent overseas and the funds come back to India, it doesn't make any difference. In the same foreign currency would be sold in the Indian market. So really it's like a round tripping. Second, that the RBI would provide and should not provide the entire amount. An initial amount can be provided of about 250 million and subsequent amount should be released on reimbursement basis based on expenditure incurred. I was just looking at how much has this been actually utilized. And as at end March 2024, an amount of 932 million has been invested by RBI in these bonds. And these investments are excluded from our foreign exchange reserves. I was privileged, along with others, to witness the handover of charge from Governor Reddy to Governor Subbarao on September 5th. And he has mentioned, I mean, he's so open and candid that he did face a credibility issue. The general surmise was that the government was sending one of its trusted civil servants to the RBI so that he would do their bidding without too much of a fuss about central bank autonomy. On September 9th, he issued a press statement. It was I think he just wrote it himself, covering the economy, monetary policy, and financial sector. Of course, on inflation, definitely inflation was high, and also its impact on growth. And he did say that he will be monitoring the situation closely and continuously, and be mindful of the implications of a monetary stance on the growth prospects and take action as appropriate. But what I really liked was his statement on the financial sector reform. One is, of course, that the financial sector reform should aim at improving efficiency and financial stability. But that financial sector reforms are not an end in themselves. They have meaning and relevance only if they are anchored in real sector objectives. And this statement was made a few days before the global financial crisis, when the developed world recognized that a dominant financial sector cannot sustain on its own. In fact, I think he really elaborated on this, and I really think it's important for each of us to really read this. This is not in the book, but this is a lecture he gave at the JRD Tata Memorial speech in the midst of the ongoing financial crisis on July 31st, 2009. He mentioned that the magic of the financial sector gave it such a larger-than-life profile that we began to believe that for every real-life problem, no matter how complex, there is a financial sector solution. I really think, Subha, you should copyright this statement. It's so profound. Now, of course, we know better. For every real-life problem, no matter how complex, there is a financial sector solution, which is wrong. To quote again from this lecture, forgotten in the euphoria of financial alchemy is the basic tenet that the financial sector has no standing of its own. It derives its strength and resilience from the real economy. It is the real economy that should drive the financial sector, not the other way around. The question that we should be asking is not how to put the financial sector back on the high growth trajectory, but how can we keep real sector growth on a high trajectory? I found this analysis brilliant and refreshing, particularly given this number of reports that RBI was having, then to look at the financial sector reforms. And I think this probably gave us a sense of direction. And yes, Subha did want us to prepare a roadmap for reforms in the financial sector, and we did do a very detailed exercise. About the global, of course, soon after we had this global financial crisis, and already Subha has mentioned about baptism by fire as he stepped into this unprecedented crisis. Well, all our financial markets, equity, bond, money markets, and forex came under intense pressure. We did issue a press release very well, just before the markets opened, and assuring markets of rupee and foreign currency liquidity, and also various measures to deal with lumpy demands as well as improve the supply of foreign exchange. But the next day, we did witness huge outflows on that day, and rupee weakened sharply, debunking the decoupling theory, which Subbarao just also mentioned. In fact, very recently, I was reading an article in the Financial Times on the recent mayhem in markets on why global investors find it so easy to sell Japan. The context was the huge sell-off in Japan, and one of the traders was quoted as saying that Japan is the place where the investment world comes to punish risk. And it was further mentioned that it's easier to sell Japan into a route than any other Asian market. Why I'm mentioning this is I remember even at that time when the sell-off happened in 2008, one of the dealers, and in fact it was mentioned by a couple of them, that it was not India that they were selling, but the FIS found it easier to exit Indian assets because of the liquidity and depth in India, which was better than many other emerging economies. I think this is, I don't know how much comfort this will give, but that was what was said by the dealers. And I think the terrorist attacks certainly, and on 26th November, was really, really tense. And the finance minister, his mention was very keen that there should be no contagion from into the financial markets from the terrorist attacks. But I think the financial infrastructure proved to be resilient, and the markets were back in 2 days. Of course, in response to the crisis, we implemented several measures. I'll not go through that. But one thing I want to mention is so many, I mean, some were conventional, unconventional, some were already in the act, which was never used, and we did use that refinance facility. Decisions were taken swiftly, and we never felt Subbarao was a greenhorn. And now, of course, dealing with the stubborn inflation was a real challenge during that period. And world over, during that time, and while we are facing very high inflation, the world over countries were still in the crisis mode. And we went into, like Subha mentioned, into this Lehman crisis morphed into a sovereign debt crisis in Europe. And India had to consider how to exit from this easy money policy. The challenge for a central bank is when to signal a change in stance and what should be the magnitude of the change. As Mr. Subbarao has stated, when inflation is high, bringing it down to a low and steady rate while minimizing the impact on growth is by far the biggest challenge of monetary policy. And I'm sure this resonates with all of us. Even recent times, I mean, we've seen inflation hit the developed world, maybe due to supply side challenges, but central banks, and therefore the central banks were reluctant to raise rates on the ground that this is transitory, but it turned out that it was not really transitory, and they had to resort to increased highs very rapidly. This was criticized as central banks being behind the curve. And now, when some labor market data has shocked the market, again, economists are saying maybe the central bank is behind the curve on easing rates. So I guess now, in terms of inflation, central banks want to be sure that the inflation is on the right trajectory and are not convinced with just 1 or 2 data points. The fear is that if we start reducing the rates and the inflation reappears, larger hikes will be required as the credibility of the central bank will be at stake. Post-global financial crisis, the challenges for central banks has magnified and become more complex. I would like to share the excellent remarks made by Dr. Subbarao in a conference held by RBI in 2012 titled The New Trilemma. The new trilemma is that of simultaneously ensuring price stability, financial stability, and sovereign debt stability. This term referred more to the problems faced by developed economies then, because as you know, we did find several countries facing a sovereign debt crisis. However, it could apply to any country. He characterized the new trilemma as a holy trilemma and raised the question on how the 3 objectives underlying the trilemma reinforce and conflict with each other. On price stability, he said the fundamental responsibility of price stability for central banks should not be compromised. And of course, he has written that in the book also as to how it's important to ensure that central banks have autonomy in setting monetary policy, and that we should have a political central bank. On sovereign debt sustainability, he was of the view that central banks' responsibility should only be restricted to protecting financial stability. And in the matter of ensuring financial stability, the government must normally leave the responsibility to the regulators and assume an activist role only in times of crisis. I think these are principles which will really last. And even when the FSTC was set up in 2010, the autonomy, the autonomy of the regulators is protected. Hopefully, I know this particular principle that governments, yes, you will need a fiscal support, fiscal the FISC to come into the picture when a crisis situation happens. About the taper tantrum, which is again another crisis that Subha had to handle. I wasn't in the Reserve Bank, but this what surprises me is that the comments made by the Fed chair that the Fed would at some future date reduce the volume of its bond purchases had such an extreme bond market reaction just to a mere possibility of less support in the future. It underscored the degree to which bond markets had become addicted to Fed stimulus. It is not as if the market was not aware that the support at some point will have to be withdrawn, and the communication should not have created the panic. But yes, it did, and he had to withdraw this statement. And one really makes one wonders whether central banks are hostage to markets all over the world. I guess not necessarily all the time, but some situations. According to, for our own taper tantrum, like Subbarao has mentioned in his book, we were hardwired for a crisis, and the taper announcement just triggered it. His actual language is hardwired for a crisis. I've just added that taper announcement triggered it. We were running a huge current account deficit, which was higher than the safe limits for 3 years in a row, and was threatening to do so for a 4th year. This, combined with the high fiscal deficit, was a near BOP crisis in 2013. In normal circumstances, the exchange rate should adjust to bring CAD in line, but these were not normal circumstances. He mentioned how market intervention by RBI is always a game of wits. Speculators are forever trying to guess the timing and extent of market intervention, and the RBI's challenge is to wrong-foot these expectations. Acknowledging that the massive correction in the rupee was unavoidable would not only manage expectations, but also act as a lesson for the future. This did not go well with the markets, and
I think she is muted.
Since when I've been muted? Just now? I hope not for too long. Thanks for telling me.
No, just a fraction of a minute.
Okay, good. You told me. I think this touch laptops now, anything touches even slightly. I recall long ago reading an article on central bank credibility versus predictability. The author had mentioned that where central banks should be credible, they should not be predictable. This is particularly applicable for interventions in markets by central banks, as that really gives the speculators the ability to game. And no doubt the crisis was handled after 4 months, and I think the adjustment in the exchange rate really helped, because we did see exports increasing and supply of generally the sentiment improving too. No doubt there were other measures that helped, like the forex swap for banks at a fixed cost of 3.5%. And of course, most important, the Fed decided to indefinitely postpone the taper issue. We've been using the non-resident Indians to help us out, like even earlier 2 times when we issued the RB bonds and the Indian Millennium bonds, we did add to our reserves, and that gave confidence to the markets. I think one particular statement, I hope I have not taken too much time. I just mentioned this as to, there was criticism against him as to why we didn't why did we not increase our reserves, and why, when there was huge capital inflows in 2010 and 11, because I was also around at that time. But I think it's very important that market participants, and even Subha was of the view that market participants and corporates in particular should learn to manage exchange rate risk and not outsource their risk management to RBI. we had other challenges during his time. One was restructuring the Asian Clearing Union, and of course, the issue of where the debt management office should lie. I'll not go into it, but just mention that it is important that sovereign debt management, to realize that it is much more than a mere resource raising exercise, especially in developing country like ours, where the size and dynamics of government market borrowing has a much wider influence on interest rate movements, systemic liquidity, and financial stability. And I think I should I just mention one thing, that about how he really we used to meet the editors of news media and explain the rationale of our policies. Communication, he has stressed a lot on communication, and we also held town hall meetings. Just to end, I'll say that it was a privilege to have had the opportunity to work with him for a little less than 3 years. The hallmark of his career, which is also reflected in the way he has written this book and the earlier book, has been one of intellectual integrity. He's honest to the core, self-effacing, and has immense curiosity to learn. He's an ideal technocrat and sets the bar high. When he took over, he made it clear to us that no one should second guess him. I hope we have been able to meet the expectation. I'll again reiterate that each one of you should not miss the opportunity of reading this very interesting and unique book. Thank you.
Thank you, Shyamala. I guess I missed my
yes,
chance to ask a few questions before turning over to the discussants. And what I do hope that perhaps Mr. Garg covers is, this point on gender disparity that Subbarao has mentioned. And what I'd like to know from him, and perhaps from you, Subbarao, is what accounts for the change in gender disparity, which very clearly is happening. And, it's a subject that I have more than a casual interest in, having worked on it. And what we have is that the CMIE data shows that basically that only 10% of the female workforce is in working. And then you have the World Bank in a recent report saying that we are missing out on the gender dividend or dividend, the demographic dividend. So that's one question. And on inflation, I would have liked, Ms. Gopinath gave us, that there was inflation all around. What I don't understand, either that period, and I remember pointing it out, and now, so if you look at the taper tantrum, it was that our inflation had been much higher than that of the other countries, and obviously much higher than the US. And so therefore, a depreciation was long overdue, unlike some of the other countries that were involved in the taper tantrum. So what accounts for that? And second, my perennial question on inflation, and here, Mr. Garg, please try and answer this question. What have vegetable prices and food prices got to do with monetary policy? With that, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you, Chairman Surjit, Bhalla, and it's good afternoon to everyone. Very nice to see Dr. Subbarao and Shyamala ji after quite some time. It's such a pleasure. I must start by thanking Dr. Subbarao for writing this book. This is fabulous. It's very informative. It gives you so much of information. It reconstructs the history including from the times of when he served as sub-collector and thereafter. I think this is a very valuable addition to the literature on India's administration and governance. Thank you very much. It has also touched a lot of hearts. Today I was in the morning delivering a keynote address at the CFO's Turning Point organized by the ET. I ran into a person. When I mentioned that today afternoon I have this program, so he said, I've read the book. He has read the book already. And he said, what a book, what touched me, he mentioned 2 instances that told me that he has read the book. One, Dr. Subbarao's revisit to Parthipuram, the place where he was the sub-collector, unannounced, just to go and see what the life is after 25 or 30 years of difference. And the letter he writes at the end to his mother, an imaginary letter, but addressing very real life issues faced by so many people. So I must again congratulate you for doing this national service, if I may say so. I think every reader reads the book for a different reason. I don't think everybody reads it for the same reason. Why did I read it? I met Dr. Rao for the first time sometime in 2004 when he had joined the Economic Advisory Council, and I was serving as the Joint Secretary in the Plant Finance Division or the State Finance Division of the Ministry of Finance, where I incidentally also interacted with Shyamala ji for the first time. And there, we were there in one of the meetings RBI used to organize for the state finance secretaries. And sitting next to me was Dr. Rao. And the way he interacted in the meeting, commented, convinced me that there is a person who is absolutely sincere to the core, who means well, he is honest. And that is the kind of respect which I developed for him from that time onwards. Incidentally, there is a lot of parallel between his career and my career in the service. He joined as director in the economic affairs. I also served as director in the economic affairs. He was promoted as joint secretary. I was also promoted as joint secretary during that period. And both of us served as Secretary Economic Affairs and some time as Finance Secretary. So there is so much of parallel between his career and mine, so to say. So I was very keen to know how, with his honesty and a candid approach to the things, how did he handle things in the districts as sub-collector and the collector and all, and more particularly, how did he sort of deal with the issues in the economic affairs? That was my very serious interest. He mentioned that I wrote a book. We also make policy on my tenure in the economic affairs. So I was very keen to know how did he sort of describe his tenure in the economic affairs. I had read that book, Who Moved My Interest Rate, very much, which is a very detailed and good account. So these were the reasons I read the book. I must say, I wasn't disappointed. I was, in fact, very happy to have read it. And I found the account, and I think every reader who would read this book would find that account absolutely truthful. I don't think he has hidden away wherever he failed. It's not a propaganda where he describes it as something great he has done. I don't think that's the voice coming out of the book. It's a plain, simple, straight description of the events, as honest as it can be, and that. You see, I think when you span a career of 35 to 40 years, you bring what in that particular time period the issues were and how were those handled. So that is what I find very well described in the book. I would today not address the issues which Surjit has mentioned. I would focus on the book today more, because that's which I think is the main occasion today. I would comment on something where I found that perhaps the description could have been more sort of revealing, more telling, because as I feel, and let me begin with the last tenure in the government, the economic affairs tenure, where you have described the events. Some of the, of course, as I said, these are very well, very good addition. So if I may take one or two issues of that period and sort of bring out why did you not sort of tell this part of that story, and would you be sort of willing to do it now? I think that would perhaps add more to what my curiosity is, and I think what readers might actually be expecting. Let me take one issue about the economic affairs, the issue of the farm waiver, which you have handled as finance secretary, and it was in the budget, the only budget which you helped write and was presented there. I think you have described the story about the political sort of case for, case against. What I was looking for was how did you approach the entire issue? What was your take on this? And what was your belief, your own belief? Did you think that the farm waivers was not a good idea, or what is a good idea? And for that particular view, what did you do to hold that or to push that view? I have taken from your book that you have set for yourself a limit that a civil servant's role is to offer a good advice, argue for it. But at some point of time, if a political decision has been made, then it becomes the civil servant's duty to sort of take that forward. Shyamala also recounted the story about the lending or the investment by RBI into the IFCL for bonds, etc. There also, and many other stories you have related in the book where you decided a point, and at that point you leave it, that no more. But I am very keen to know where did you stand and did you push? Similar is the one more case. I don't think we have too much time to go for. I have many questions, but I'll take one more as far as the economic affairs is concerned. You describe in great detail about the telecom pricing issue, including finally the JPC testimony and the evidence in the CBI code and all. And what I gathered is that when the file first came to you, you took a view that the government should not go by the price of 2001, and it should be discovered in the market, of course, by auctioning. That is a market discovery is what you pleaded for. Despite a well-argued opinion from the TRAI that it should be awarded because this was the additional telecom sort of licenses in addition to the incumbent two players. So you are actually trying to create a level playing field. So for whatever reasons, you took a view that it should be market discovered. But when a little later, a few months later, the two ministers decided that let the government go by the 2001 price, and they presented, as you write, they presented to the Prime Minister that compromise or that solution, and you also record that you recorded the minutes of that, but you have not disclosed in the book why, when before the ministers reached that agreement, where did you stand in relation to the ministers? What did you tell them? Were you overruled, or you stuck or you decided not to stick your neck out, or whatever the decision, and you recorded that minutes. So what was the reality there? To my mind, these books, the kind of which you have written, are actually a very good historical addition to India's literature. We don't have a tradition in the finance ministry, at least, of writing the story of policy making. And the people have no way, the researchers have no way to get to that. We don't open it up for them. And whenever any such book comes, I think that is what helps a lot to know. So I think I'll leave that question also. So these two questions relating to the story relating to your economic affairs story. So given the time constraint, I'll just take you a little bit to your sub-collector and the collectorship, which I noted was where you tried to do exactly what the law demanded, whether it's the restoration of tribals' land, or handling the ITDB and other issues. So what struck me was that you took upon yourself, and you in fact sort of took it to the Chinna Reddy type of governor, and you didn't buckle down to in that respect, the restoration of tribal land, etc. So later on, the way the things played out, what you wanted to achieve was not achieved. So in a way, there was that well-intentioned move did not really succeed. Is that the complete story, or there is something more to it? And I'll raise one more question relating to that period. When the emergency was sort of imposed, and there was a drive against the hoarders, you describe very vividly that you, as young officer of the district, would go open the godowns, create the impression that the government is actually doing so much against the hoarders and all. And then what struck me, because I wouldn't describe this today, I also tried very unconventional approaches in the district and the subdivisional, but your approach was that you decided to sort of teach them a lesson kind of thing, and being pragmatic also enough, you devise on some formula to make them make contribution to Prime Minister's Relief Fund. And what struck me is that once the contribution was made to the Prime Minister's Relief Fund, then you write in your book that you destroyed the papers. Now, this I found a little odd. So what happens where the compromise is not struck? did you follow that case to their logical end, prosecuted them, whatever? And is it a good practice to do something where if a extracurricular objective is achieved, well-intentioned, good, but at the same time, it requires you to destroy the records? I think that I found a little odd as a kind of approach. As a young man, as a young collector, one can do all this thing. I can understand. But was it thought through? Was it a sound approach? The young collectors who might read the book, should they go through that route or should they not? I think given the time constraints, I'll stop here. It's an excellent book. I thoroughly enjoyed. I've read every word of it, and I would thank you again for doing it. All the best. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garg. Dr. Subbarao, would you like to respond now, and then we'll turn it over to the questions. While you respond to the several questions asked, and the couple that I asked in the beginning is, and since we have a central bank governor and a former finance secretary and a deputy governor, should India institute something parallel to the Humphrey Hawkins testimony or law, where the central bankers explain their actions and what has happened to the government, the parliament, if you will? Thank you very much. Over to you. You're muted. Muted.
You are muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Bhalla. I will take a few minutes to address some of these points. I can't answer all the substantive questions that you've raised. In fact, I was not prepared for that. But let me meet some of the points raised by you and by Shyamala and Subhash. First, about the point you raised, about fiscal deficits, whether they fuel inflation or not. I mean, that's a weighty question. It's not necessary that fiscal deficits always fuel inflation. We know that fiscal deficits have several problems. The high interest payments, they eat up a lot of expenditure. They crowd out private investment. They spill over into the external sector. They can create inflation. But in the context of the period that I was serving in the Reserve Bank, and we had a high point of inflation from 2009 up until 2013, there was a high inflation, high fiscal deficit, and it is quite easy to see the correlation. Inflation was a result of so many factors, but one of the big driving factors was, in fact, fiscal deficit combined with a revenue deficit. The UPA government, you recall that period, policy paralysis, they were doling out money, borrowing and doling out money, so there was no production but just consumption. That is fueling inflation. So my answer to your question is, it is not formulaic, it's not necessary that fiscal deficits always fuel inflation. But especially in that situation we were in 2009 to 12, the high inflation was driven largely by fiscal deficits. The second question you asked about, gender disparity to gender parity, etc., and female labor force participation rate. I'm surprised that Charan has not held a seminar on FLPR so far, but FLPR is worthy of a seminar by itself. And I've been involved in some studies and some discussions on why India's female labor force participation rate is low, and what is more worrisome, it is declining. It is lower than that of our neighbors of Bangladesh, of Nepal, Sri Lanka, which is quite distressing. And like you mentioned, there is a gender dividend to be got, which is if we get women into the workforce, we have a big advantage of increase in GDP. I've heard several explanations about why FLPR is falling or not improving. Cultural norms, that women have to take care of children. But this is nothing new. Women have always been taking care of children. I mean, this is not just something that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years. So this is a responsibility women have been bearing. In fact, if anything, men are taking a little more of that responsibility. So that cannot be an explanation. The second explanation I've heard is that girls are staying longer in education. They're studying longer. Therefore, the participation is low. But if that is the case, it should be a one-time jump. There should be a quantum drop and a quantum jump. It should not be a continuous decline. So the one explanation which I found quite persuasive is that this is a result of incomes going up. Across the country, except in the Northeast, incomes have moved up. And the labor to leisure ratio or labor to leisure trade-off has changed. Women are unwilling to work at the going wage. If in fact wages go up, more women will come back into the labor market. So it is in some sense a problem of success rather than a problem of failure. That is my explanation, but it is an open question. But thank you for raising that. And now Shyamala has raised many points. I cannot again respond or meet all of them. She's talked about my battle with the Reserve Bank as Finance Secretary to get the Reserve Bank to agree to spend a part of the foreign exchange reserves for infrastructure financing purposes. What I've tried to say in the book is actually a narration of what happened. As I clearly say, my stance or my view was that we should not be spending, yielding foreign exchange reserves for infrastructure purposes. It's the thin end of a wedge, etc. But I had to yield to it as a civil servant, and that story is Shyamala has described it very well. Some people have asked me, because this is incidental to my career, both as finance secretary and as the governor, that you have not been, even-handed. That you write about your conflicts or your concerns or battles with the government as the governor of RBI. You've not written so much about the pressures you put on RBI, that you've not been even-handed. I think that is unfair because in the book I admit, on the matter of dividend, for example, Shyamala, deputy governor, would pressure me as the finance secretary to yield more dividend to the government. I would resist that pressure. But when I crossed the line and went to the other side, when I became governor, I resisted pressure from the government. But what is important was that for much of the time, we were able to resolve these disputes quite amicably behind closed doors, as Subhash, Garg, as finance secretary himself would know. But this blew up much later for a variety of reasons. I'm not privy to that inside story, but I want to mention that. Now, Subhash Garg has raised a number of points. In fact, he's questioned me exactly the way the JPC and the Parliament Standing Committee and the CBI have questioned me, which is that you took a stand, but after that you caved in, that you just gave in. Now, I didn't want to write the entire story from where I took a stand and where I caved in, because there's nothing there except saying that I pressed my point in internal meetings with the ministers, in groups of ministers, with the Prime Minister. But at a point of time, the ministers decide, and they were not deciding anything that is illegal or irregular. In fact, I say in the context of the 2G pricing issue itself, that there is a merit in the argument that the 2007 spectrum must be given at 2001 prices. There is a merit in that argument, but I took a stand, and the government in its wisdom decided, and it is open to a democratically elected government to decide to give spectrum at less than market prices. It is not open to me as the finance secretary to say that, look, that is wrong, because it is not wrong. In my view, it is ill-advised. And I said that. But beyond the point, I could not press it. Subhash, your point is, why did I not write about the entire drama? The entire drama I thought was irrelevant because it is standard fare. And it would show me as a hero. I was a bit concerned about projecting myself in that. Similarly, you talk about, my district experience, about my experience or exposure to tribal development and implementing the law. I Same issue about restoring lands to tribals, I had done both as sub-collector, Parvatipuram, and as collector. But the circumstances in the two districts were different. I did not realize as a young, inexperienced officer that the vehemence or the aggressiveness or the determination with which I implemented tribal protection laws in my first posting, I could not pursue in the second posting because the circumstances there were different. I was too inexperienced to know. Perhaps some of those things I should have brought out, but thank you for raising them. I'll stop here, Chairman Bhalla.
Mr. Chairman, you are mute.
I am mute, yes. Thank you very much. I said I'll open up the floor to some questions and then we can maybe close.
Yeah,
Dr.
may I?
Vishal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Subbarao and all the panelists. It was a sheer delight to listen to you. 2-3 questions comes to me, and let me outrightly admit that I have not read the book, but I have read a little bit of excerpts of this. But you have aroused in our curiosity to read the full-length book. That I will do immediately from tomorrow. Now, 2-3 questions. You served a very distinguished career from 1972 to 2011, 39 years. Do you have any regret when you look back what you ought to have done or what you wanted to do but could not do? That is question one. Second, you served in 3 districts, Khammam, Visakhapatnam and Prakasham, and of course Visakhapatnam is very well developed, but I'm sure you must have gone after becoming the district collector, and what you see the trajectory of growth in these 3 districts particularly in today's time, and you would have dreamed to be different than what they are actually today. And when you were the finance secretary, you were dealing with the governors, and I understand you were not quite happy many times as a finance secretary with the governor. When you changed the line, did you appreciate or you gave a second thought to yourself? I was not reasonable at that time when I was finance secretary.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other? Okay, we are at 5:36. So if there are other questions, let's gather 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll turn over to Dr. Rao. Or in the meantime, Dr. Subbarao, why don't you answer Vishal Das's questions?
Yeah, those are very deep questions. Again, I'll try to do justice. Do I have any regrets? Of course I do. I mean, which reasonable person would not have regrets about past career? In the real time, you do things, and later on probably realize that you should have done things differently. Again, just one thing that comes to my mind in this context as a response to your question is what I just said in response to Subhash's point, which is that in implementing the tribal protection laws, should I have appreciated the differences between the 2 situations? Of course, I was implementing the law, but should I have shown some differentiation? That is a big regret. Regrets about some of the things I could not do, both within the government and in the RBI. There's never a time when a reasonable person can say that I have accomplished everything that I wanted to. So there is always, I wouldn't say regret, but there is some sense of dissatisfaction that you could not do everything that you wanted to do. But in real time, you do what you think is the best. Okay. Differences, certainly there have been, across the country, 50 years, lots of changes have occurred. And in the districts I serve, changes have occurred, and because I've been seeing them continuously, I'm imperceptible to those changes. It's just like how you see a child growing up. You don't, if you see a child after 5 years, you just see the child has grown up. But if you're seeing the child every day, you don't see that growth, right? Same thing like that with me. Parvatipuram, I enjoyed going back there because 50 years I've not gone back there. And I describe all the difference, I remember the pothole roads and the roads with the bullock carts and cattle and sheep and people and lorries and broken cars and broken jeeps, etc. Today you have world-class highways, swanky buildings, structures where people are well fed. There's economic activity. Nobody's idle. So lots of things, particularly Parvatipuram, my recall is that 11 o'clock in the morning, you go to walk on the main street, there'll be people sitting under a tree or in a tea shop because they have no work to do. They're just, gossiping. When I went back there 50 years later, there was economic activity across the main street. Nobody was idle. They were doing something. That's big change. And I said the bakery index that I talk about, Parvatipuram was 60 kilometers from Vizag. If I wanted to have breakfast day after tomorrow, I wanted to have bread for breakfast day after tomorrow. Like, for example, on today is Friday. If I wanted to have breakfast on bread for breakfast on Sunday morning, I had to decide today. My cook would have to order bread through the RTC bus driver, who would have to bring it from Vizag. He would have to stand on the roadside, collect it. But today, when I went back to Parvatipuram, in the short distance of a kilometer from the town end to the bus stand, I could count at least 5 bakeries. So Parvatipuram had just moved up on the bakery index. So lots of changes have happened. Thank you.
Sir, can I ask a question? Hello, sir.
Certainly, yeah.
I know it's 5:40 and I know Shyamala madam has another engagement. She had clearly told us a quick question. I just can't let this opportunity.
Shyamala madam has to go back to sleep.
She has another engagement at 6 a.m. That's why she.
No, you just okay.
So,
It doesn't matter. No, you can ask. I have. There's another 15 minutes. No problem.
With the former governor, with the former finance secretary, and Subhash Chandra Garg, of course, here, and former deputy governor, I just can't resist the temptation. And of course, me and Surjit Bhalla are on the same page. I guess so. Sir, I have a feeling, and I didn't see it extensively covered in this book, on inflation targeting. I have a feeling that inflation targeting really doesn't serve the purpose in an emerging country because it stifles growth. While you were the governor, you didn't let it come through. But as you left, it just came in with a wave, like a tsunami. Would you have a view on it? Or while you resisted it, but though while you were there at the helm of affairs, this issue had already taken over the rest of the world? Thank you.
Yeah, and before you answer, let me add to that a related question. This is that unlike the US, England, etc., the other countries that we compare ourselves to, and for very good reasons, we are called argumentative Indians, because we have a view on everything. But it seems that, and sometimes completely unfounded, but there is a debate, there is a discussion. Somehow, and I don't expect sitting officers in the government to criticize another member of the government, but I do expect the financial media and various other observers to be just mildly critical of what the central bank does. So I was very relieved and encouraged by Mr. Garg's questions. But now he's out of the office and he was a government official, so I don't expect government officials to say. But my general question is about the financial profession, that, somehow the RBI is a holy cow. We can't touch it. And so therefore that's related to this very same question of inflation targeting, that it's accepted to be correct by the financial media, by the government, by most people to be unqualified success or to even be a success, to get unqualified. And I think the evidence on inflation targeting, which we enthusiastically took over, and which is attributed by some to be responsible for the decline in inflation, but not food inflation. I just think that we need to move forward. So having been in government, in the central government, having been in the RBI, and now outside, your comments on this, please. Thank you. Dr. Subbarao, yeah. Mute.
Thank you. I thought I was going to talk about my book and I was not prepared to talk about more substantive issues. But since you raised it, Surjit, I had reservations about inflation targeting. I wrote about that in my previous book. I mentioned that also in this book for several reasons, which is that at that time in 2007-8, up until I left, actually, we did not have a single inflation index for the entire country. We were targeting WPI. There was no single CPI for the country. That came in 2012, CPI rural and urban. So the second concern or reservation I had was that inflation in India is triggered largely by supply shocks, whereas monetary policy is best suited to manage inflation arising from demand shocks. So whether inflation targeting would become, would lose credibility if you have an inflation target and the RBI is not able to deliver on that because inflation is driven by supply shocks, price of food and oil. The third reservation I had was about the administered interest rate regime, which that the monetary policy transmission will not be efficient enough to change the inflation situation, and RBI will lose credibility in spite of having inflation target because of administered interest rates. But the first, we embarked on inflation targeting on 2016. And I think for the first 5 years, the record was quite credible. And in fact, I wrote somewhere and I said somewhere that inflation targeting was not in fact tested because inflation remained low. So the question of inflation targeting being tested did not come up. But afterwards, it was tested. And over the last 5 years, since COVID, RBI has been struggling to deliver on the inflation targeting. They've brought it within the target range, although not to the target. So the question today is the counterfactual. Are we better off with no inflation targeting? I'm not so sure that we should move away from inflation targeting, having embarked on it once, because giving up on inflation targeting now, for good or bad, now giving up on it would cause enormous instability concern about the inflation situation. So we're stuck to it. It's like mafia. You can enter the mafia, you can't get out. So it's like that. It's a one-way street. I'm not saying that inflation targeting is not served the purpose. But even if you're of the view that inflation targeting is not served the purpose, I don't believe that we should get out of it. It's inadvisable. One other issue that's come up in this context in the recent financial economic survey is that RBI must target core inflation, knock away food. I don't think that is a wise thing to do, because then RBI will find it very difficult to communicate and it will have no credibility. After all, food is 46% of the CPI basket. If you knock out food and you're saying you're managing inflation, people will look upon RBI as a stupid institution. Inflation is what people experience in the market. And what people are experiencing is the price of food and fuel. If you knock that out and say RBI is targeting some core inflation, which people don't experience, I don't think RBI will have any credibility and RBI will be able to manage inflation expectations. So the better thing to do, as some people have suggested, including Janak Raj, who was formerly executive director in the RBI, is to revisit the CPI basket and adjust the weights to reflect the current proportion of food in the consumption basket, which arguably is lower than 45%, which is the current weight. So I think that'll be a better approach to inflation targeting. But of course, there are lots of other things we must do. Research we can have a separate session on inflation targeting, all the things that we must do and examine when inflation targeting comes up for a review. I don't know when it is, this year or next year. We should look at all of them.
Thank you very much. Before I turn over to Dr. Charan Singh to close, one, there have been two suggestions, apart from a very, very interesting seminar and lots of issues being discussed. Two issues come up, Charan Singh, for you and for EGROW. One is to have a seminar on inflation targeting, and I think to have a former central bank governor would be the ideal person to be there, and to get somebody from the financial sector to see if you can find anybody who's a critic of inflation targeting. And I'm happy to present myself as one of the speakers to challenge the orthodoxy of inflation targeting. And the second one, and I think you are having this on female labor force participation, which I do think is both an outstanding issue and an outstanding issue that is little understood. I'll be happy to send you, sir, the very detailed paper on female labor force participation in labor markets in India, which shows that we are, forget comparators in Asia, our most neighbors, but including East Asia and Latin America, we are very close to their average. So I think the other point on that, which I've stressed often enough, we don't pay enough attention to data. I don't know when we'll begin to do so, but inflation targeting is very similar to that question, or very similar to that point, that we make observations more on ideology and preconceived notions than on actual data. But thank you for very much encouraging that discussion, and I'm sure Charan Singh will do something about it. Over to you, Charan.
Thank you so much. I know Madam Shyamala Gopinath has to leave. She had specifically told me she has sat with us from 3:30 a.m. in the morning to 5 a.m. And incredible. Madam, we want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. And of course, to the main speaker, former Governor, Dr. Subbarao, I would take your suggestion of inflation targeting. I'll invite you again as a former governor who was the governor just before inflation targeting was implemented in a very strong manner. Because you and Dr. Reddy both sort of deflected inflation targeting for a very long time and continued with Bimal Jalan's multiple indicator approach. Though Dr. Rangarajan has used the concept of flexible inflation targeting, the other way could have been to revisit inflation target and raise it a little bit, because changing the weight in the basket, which is based on a scientific survey, and food continues to be an important ingredient in a country which is so poor, may not be the right way to just change the weight. But alternative could be that we could increase the target from ±2. We could raise it to either ±3, or we could say 3 ±2 or something like that, so that we change the upper band. With this, I want to thank Dr. Subbarao. I want to thank him for accepting, despite his busy schedule, to come and speak about his book. I also want to thank Mr. Subhash Chandra Garg for accepting our request, and of course, Madam Shyamala Gopinath for having obliged us despite her very busy schedule. I want to thank you, Sir Bhalla, sir. Though you are our advisor, but I know how busy you are and how much you travel to have accepted our request to be in the chair today. Very quick announcement. We will probably have the employment seminar within the next fortnight, and I'll send you an invite once again. The one, if you have missed the previous seminar we had on employment with Golder presented, Dr. Surjit Bhalla was a discussant in that. I would invite you to have a look at the website. It's a fantastic webinar, conceptually, how clear it is, and data problems that we have so clearly mentioned there. Next week, on a Friday, we continue our journey of states, where we are looking at the fastest falling state, Punjab. Why? And then week after, we start on states which have done exceedingly well, Telangana, Karnataka, Kerala, Maharashtra, and Gujarat. So that journey continues. Bhalla sir, I'm with you. We did 6 webinars on women, female labor force participation, women empowerment under the G20. We are total first possible slot in October. We will dedicate to inflation target, and immediately after that to the female labor force participation, which you have mentioned. With this, let me thank you all, the participants, for being here. Thank each one of you for being here with us, enriching the discussion, and also to the speaker and the discussants and the chair.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.